Hello everybody, this is Nick, this is Entropian, and in our today's video I will be benchmarking the Rainbow Six Siege Vulkan and DirectX 11 with the Asus TUF 3090 Gaming in 1080p and 1440p with our graphic settings to be maxed out and all low. So, let's do this! Για ελληνικούς υπότιτλους, αυτό που θα πρέπει να κάνετε θα είναι να έρθετε πάνω στο player σας, να κάνετε κλικ στο εικονίδιο που γράφει CC και με το που το κάνετε αυτό θα δείτε ότι θα σας βγάλει αρχικά αγγλικούς υπότιτλους. Για να πάρουμε τώρα ελληνικούς υπότιτλους θα πρέπει να κάνουμε κλικ στο γρανάζι, να έρθουμε εδώ που λέει Subtitles CC και κάνοντας κλικ εδώ πάνω να πατήσουμε μετά στο Auto Translate και να επιλέξουμε τη γλώσσα που επιθυμούμε μέσα από όλες αυτές, αλλά στη δικιά μας περίπτωση τα ελληνικά. Με το που κάνουμε κλικ έχουμε πλέον ελληνικούς υπότιτλους και είστε σε θέση να δείτε αυτό το βίντεο ναι μεν τραβηγμένο στα αγγλικά αλλά με ελληνικούς υπότιτλους. Πάμε να συνεχίσουμε τώρα. Before we begin with our frame times, FPS, input lag and until display times, graphs and tables, if you happen to land for the first time on one of my benchmark videos, I highly recommend for you to watch prior to this one the reference video I have uploaded here on my channel on YouTube, where you will be always welcome to click the subscribe button and the bell icon to keep in touch with my future uploads so that you get all the necessary information regarding my PC hardware and overall setup, which is meant to help you draw more meaningful conclusions from what comes next in this video and of course remove any possible confusion of yours that might occur. Now, with that out of the way, let's focus on what we will be after in this one. Our primary goal here is to establish an understanding on the performance and behavior differences between Vulkan and DirectX 11 when we run a system with an older CPU like the 8700K and the 3090. In addition to that, I want us to check and see if we will be facing a meaningful CPU bottleneck here and if there is an imminent need for an upgrade of someone rocking an older CPU like the 8700K. While furthermore, we will be also researching the maximum FPS range in which we can find ourselves when playing Rainbow Six Siege in 1080p with all low and maximized graphic settings, as also when we play R6 in 1440p with all low and max graphic settings again, as they appear on your monitors, in a system with the pre-mentioned specs. Finally, you need to keep in mind that in all the following tests I have been using the OSI scan profile on the 3090 TUF, and if you wonder why, then you better watch my previous video in which I was researching and answering to that. Okay, I think we're good to go. So, let's get started, shall we? Starting with our 1080p resolution now, what we will find ourselves against is by all means not a surprise. In a way at least. Beginning with our focus on the left side of the graphs, we find the frame times and the FPS graphs of the 1080p with the graphics set on all low. As I said earlier, it is not a surprise for me to see us facing exactly what we call a CPU bottleneck here. By paying attention on the graphs, we can easily see our GPU chilling continuously under our CPU total load, and this is the perfect example of what we call an 100% CPU bottleneck, where we find ourselves completely CPU bound. In addition to that, we also see that we never get to trigger or else reach our GPU power limit, and that verifies that our GPU is continuously waiting for the CPU to send frames into the pipeline, and that the produced frames from our CPU are not enough to put enough stress on our GPU, even when the benchmark finds itself in a less CPU demanding situation. By paying attention now to our tables and especially on our sensors table, we can see that a CPU with more cores will probably benefit that scenario, but judging from our averages, what we are mostly after in terms of upgrading from that situation to a better one is a CPU with a much better single and dual core frequency and performance. But do we actually find ourselves in that need? Or maybe 8700K is more than okay for us? The answer is easy, and it is a bold no, and yes at the same time. 8700K is more than enough, and we will find ourselves even on our 0.1% lows standing at 200 FPS, which is of course more than we actually need on a monitor with 144 Hz. But there is a but here. Even though 8700K is more than enough, if in the future there will be a CPU with more than 50% performance uplift in single core and dual core, accompanied with a core clock higher than our current 5000 MHz or 4.8 GHz if we are to consider our actual AVX functionality here and be fair to ourselves, then I could say that it would be a good move for us to upgrade from 8700K and have better averages, but most importantly better lows, while, as we will see later, even better system delay times. Unfortunately, there is no CPU on the market providing that at the moment. And with that in mind, I can easily say to anyone watching this video to stay put. And that because 8700K by the time I shoot this video remains a beast in terms of performance. Another conclusion you can get out of this specific test is that when we put the stress mostly on the CPU or the GPU, we will find ourselves facing a considerable deviation on the produced FPS, and this is always a bad thing. Long story short, for serious competitive gaming, yes, we can get more with a better CPU, but in any other case, we don't need a better CPU. But hey, here we find ourselves getting nearly 400 FPS on average, and we have our system's theoretical FPS max. So, let's see what happens when we crank up the graphics settings, shall we? Focusing now on the right side of our graphs, where we have the 1080p with maxed out graphics, we can see that even on 1080p we remain 100% GPU bound. So, if we are to consider our lows, you can now understand what you have heard me say a number of times if you follow me outside of YouTube, and that is that even 3090 is not enough. To define enough for me is to find myself with maxed out graphics and my minimums sitting above my monitor's refresh ratio, and the reasons for that are plenty and important. Knowing that my CPU can provide that for me and keep me above 144 or even 165 Hz, I conclude that 3090 is not enough. But because again there is a but here as always, and I'm not talking about my fat but, 3090 provides an astonishing uplift in performance in comparison to anything I've seen until today, and that is worth noting. At least today, you can find yourself playing the game with crazy FPS and maxed out graphics, and that finds us closer to what I called earlier as enough, and that is a win, if we are always to keep the price tag of the 3090 out of the way. But let's see our actual system's performance and the toll of each situation when it comes down to our input lag and until display times, shall we? Once again now you realize why I always say that when it comes down to serious competitive gaming, all our options are an one-way road for us. By virtually achieving the perfect sync times and our input lag being mostly affected by our peripherals, what we see here comes to verify what I said earlier in regard of upgrading our CPU. There is still room for further improvement until we reach the absolute, and as we can see, any kind of investment in a current day CPU for gaming will have diminishing returns, and that makes it at the same time a bad decision. It is more important to see new technologies to evolve, like the new NVIDIA Reflex, where companies start to do something about the core issue here, than letting yourselves think that it is only a CPU issue, and you will understand what I'm saying here when we proceed with our next group of graphs. But before we leave, there are some things to focus on, like the close to 100% uplift in our system delays when we max our graphics and put our GPU under real stress. If you haven't figured out why this is happening each time we do that, then I will be attaching a link on the description to an NVIDIA webpage where you will be able to read and understand better how things work on the background and why I said that the evolution of technologies like the NVIDIA Reflex are really important and expected. And with that, I think we can move forward and finally get to our 1440p graphs for the Rainbow Six Siege DirectX 11 tests. Moving to 1440p for DirectX 11 now, we begin to realize that the more we start to depend on our GPU, the worse the scenario becomes for us. And starting again with the left side of the graphs, where we have the 1440p in all low, we find ourselves facing again a CPU bottleneck, but not an absolute one. In this scenario, we are CPU bound to a certain extent, but GPU bound for the rest of it, While focusing only on our median and average FPS, someone could tell that we are only CPU bound, but that is not entirely true. We saw earlier that our CPU can retain better lows, and in our case here, we can see the impact of being GPU bound at the same time. Due to that fact, we witness both our lows and our highs to be dragged down to a certain degree, and while we still have a sick amount of FPS as our result, our frame times are taking a blow here, and they are also becoming more deviant. It is also another proof that the higher we go in resolution, the lesser CPU bound we become, and that the 1440p is somewhat the middle ground where both the GPU and the CPU are important. In this scenario, both the CPU and the GPU are working harder by all means, and you can see that we have more power consumption from our GPU and CPU when you check the sensors table. Still, the FPS provided here are sitting above my personal upper frame rate goal, which is of course the 165 FPS, and that happens even when we check our minimum values, and that is a good thing to see. Again, 8700K is more than enough for the task in hand, and 3090 proves again itself to be just enough for us to be happy with the results we get in comparison to what we had in the past, but by all means not enough for our actual goals and desires for the 1440p resolution, and that becomes even more emphatical when we check the right group of graphs, where we have our graphics maxed out, where we find ourselves being 100% GPU bound, and where we get a median value of 119 FPS, with our lows sitting on what we call acceptable and okay. I will seize the opportunity here to say that speaking for anything above 1440p for gaming is a pure joke, and you should better stay away from it because the hardware options we get nowadays are by all means not enough, and all the discussions about 4K in my eyes are greatly enforced and they serve other purposes. This is why I'm not including 4K benchmarks in my videos, and expect me to do so when it will be eventually its time, or when I will have to provide for my family through what I do here. Right? But seriously now, this is where donating and strengthening someone like me helps him to stay independent and honest. With us having now been already through the 1440p max graphs in my previous video too, I will move forward to check also our system behavior and delays in our input lag and until display times graphs. After watching these graphs, the first thing that comes into my mind again is that the more we keep out of the equation our GPU, the better it is for us in terms of system delays and FPS sync. Maxing out our graphics here results into more than 100% uplift in system delays, and everything points towards the decision of having only the absolutely necessary graphics raised, especially when playing a competitive online game like the Rainbow Six Siege, in order for us to retain always a snappy system with the acceptable competitive levels. Alright, let's take a look now to our conclusive bar chart for Rainbow Six Siege DirectX 11 for both resolutions of course, before we move forward with our Rainbow Six Siege Vulkan tests. Let's do this. Alright, and as we're ready to move forward with our 1080p resolution for Vulkan now, I have only one thing to say before we move forward, and that is God bless Vulkan and the new era application programming interfaces, aka APIs. And seriously now, it was time that we end up with APIs that will be more efficient, and they will be able to squeeze our system's resources to provide all they have. In addition to what I just said, it is also time for game developers to finally mature and start implementing properly their games on the new era APIs. That puts me in position to feel like saying that if there's one thing, if not the only thing, the Rainbow Six Siege developers did right until today, then that is their decision to translate or else rebuild the R6 on Vulkan. It was about time they do one thing right, and they did. Finally. To our graphs now, starting again from our left, where we have the 1080p in all low, we can clearly see a far smoother system behavior than the one we had with DirectX 11. Note that in the last part of this video I will be comparing the two APIs with side-by-side graphs for each case, and you will be able to understand even more what I will be saying here. Now you can realize that our problem is not only that our CPU might not be enough, but mostly that our CPU might be held back by other factors while it has more to provide in terms of performance. Can you see the uplift we get across all percentiles here? And yeah, we have a pure CPU bottleneck again, but seriously now, who cares when our minimum value sits at 230 FPS? Judging from the graphs, in our Vulkan scenario, we can get more out of a CPU with more cores than the 6 logical cores the H700K has, but it is also pointless at the same time to even think about any kind of upgrade with the performance we get here. Now, as expected, when we decide to put some color in our lives and crank up our graphic settings, that decision of ours will literally halve our FPS and overall system performance, as we will find ourselves instantly in a scenario where we are 100% GPU bound even if we are at 1080p. Our gains in comparison with the DirectX 11 performance are here again, but minimal against what we got with all graphics on low, where our CPU was taking the lead. In this scenario, we find ourselves standing within my targeted area between 144 and 165 FPS when we check our lows, and that concludes on the fact that while we are there, 3090 is barely enough for the task. I really wonder when I hear people suggesting the 3070 as the go-to card for a 1440p resolution. It reminds me of the era when all the online propaganda was trying to convince people that 1080i was again the 1440p solution. In my eyes again, we are just starting to tap into a validated 1440p era, but we are not completely there yet. And it is when we switch to our input lag and until display times graphs where you will realize why my jaw was dropped and I start praising the R6 Vulkan API implementation. 1080p or low finds us in nearly perfect sync and virtually non-existent input lag. And believe me, that is something you won't see too often. On the other hand now, maximizing our graphics nearly doubles the input lag times and induces a by more than 4 times desync. Awesome, and as we are ready to move forward with our 1440p resolution for Vulkan now, I should say that we are about to witness a rare occasion here. And yeah, what you see here is accurate, guys. 1440p or low was able to provide even more FPS across all percentiles than our theoretical max in 1080p or low was able to deliver. This is a really rare occasion where you will find both your CPU and GPU at the same spot working side by side and not having the one waiting for the other by a considerable amount of time. That is the optimal you can get out of a system, and that optimal, in our case, results into more FPS as our outcome. This is not a CPU or GPU bound scenario because the system is and it is not at the same time CPU or GPU bound. While the graph shows our GPU continuously with its power limit triggered, and that could lead us on saying that we're actually GPU bound here, paying attention at the GPU load and the CPU total load, we can see that they are actually dancing with each other. That leads into having both the parts performing continuously without dives, and as our FPS table shows, that results into more FPS than the expected less FPS against the same 1080p test. We could finally consider these results as our actual FPS max for the system and Rainbow Six Siege. Maxing out our graphics now is a punch in your face situation in terms of performance. Losing 300 FPS is something that has no excuse to sweeten that bitter outcome. So, is 3090 enough for 1440p with max graphics? At least for Rainbow Six Siege, it is not. And as I said before, 3090 is the card which actually opens in a way the 1440p era officially. Getting now to our input lag and until display times graphs, things become even more bitter, having you scratching your head, wondering if there will be an era in which we will be eventually able to have the benefits of both worlds. Max graphics gameplay without substantial input lag delays and instant frame appearance on your monitor right after one will be produced. Here we see the toll of having more GPU engagement in our 1440p all low by having our until display times raised a bit and our input lag times raised a bit too. Don't get me wrong here, I did not say that these raises are considerable, but they are measurable, and they are actually our system's functionality imprint. With that, I deny to say anything about the 1440p max in comparison to the 1440p all low, because if I do, I won't be able to continue with this video being family friendly, if you get what I mean. Okay, let's see our final bar chart for Rainbow Six Siege Vulkan and prepare ourselves to move towards the final part of this video. Let's do this. Okay, welcome to the final part of this video, and in this last part of this video I will be, as expected, I will be presenting to you a side-by-side comparison between the Rainbow Six Siege Vulkan results against the Rainbow Six Siege DirectX 11 results we got so far for both resolutions, and I will be only making a short comment for each group of results I will be presenting to you. So let's get started. In 1080p or low, Vulkan proves itself to be superior to DirectX 11, and that is not a surprise if you know the difference between them. As expected, we get a far smoother performance with Vulkan, and that results in a whooping FPS uplift across all percentiles. The input lag and sync gains are here too, and they lean towards the absolute we can achieve. In 1080p max, we witness again a smoother system behavior overall, with by far more consistent and less deviant frame times, which is something that results into more than considerable raise on our lows, but a toll on our highs, which keeps our median and average close to the DirectX 11 results. Our input lag and sync system times are benefited too, with an emphasis on having better until display times, due to the balanced load on our CPU and GPU under the R6 Vulkan API. 1440p all low now proves to us why DirectX 11 must die as an API yesterday, by having Vulkan raising our lows with close to 100 FPS and consistent big gains across all percentiles, while the frame times and FPS deviation drop imprints the smoother system behavior we get here with Vulkan. Vulkan gains are present in our input lag and until display times too, as it was expected of course, and we find ourselves getting more in the reduction of our input lag times. In 1440p max now, as we find ourselves heavily GPU bound, while the benefits of Vulkan over DirectX 11 are here, are not substantial but still considerable. The biggest benefit here is the reduction in the overall frame times and FPS deviation. Again, with more balanced system resources evaluation from Vulkan, we end up with far better and consistent until display times, while we also see some minor benefits in the input lag times we get overall. Alright, and in order for us to summarize our today's video, it's time for us to get our final conclusive bar chart, in which I will have everything we saw today against each other in order for us to get the full picture here. Let's see it. Alright folks, this is the end of our today's benchmark video, and while I did my best to provide as much value out of it, I hope you got that value and you got some value at least out of this video. And as long as this video is over now until my next video, I will be seeing you on my social media profiles or in the chat of any of my future live streams, in order for us to have further discussion regarding 3090 or anything else about gaming. And yeah, until next time, have fun and enjoy your lives, guys.